At a gap in the city walls which once took the pilgrim from Ypres to Menin, the Menin Gate Memorial stands as a monument to those soldiers missing in Flanders fields. Why the Menin Gate? Who does it commemorate? And what does it mean to us, nearly a century since its construction? We've returned to Ypres for this episode, and we're standing outside the railway station close to the centre of Ypres itself. And this is a bit of a follow-on walk, really, to the walk we did recently on the podcast, going from right in the very centre of Ypres, near the Cloth Hall, out via the Lille Gate to Hellfire Corner. This connects up with that walk because we're about to go from the railway station, around the ramparts, all the way around this time, via the Lille Gate, and end at the Menin Gate, where the impressive Menin Gate Memorial is located. So we begin outside the modern railway station, which in recent years has undergone quite an extensive renovation. It's now the railway station and the bus station combined, and it's a very bustling part of the city of Ypres, and indeed was just like that in many respects, both before the Great War, at various points during the Great War when this was a route to the front line, and then in the post-war world as well, when tourist battlefield pilgrims came into the area to visit the old battlefields around Ypres itself. The original railway station was 19th century in origin, when railway lines were put across this part of Belgium, and it linked before the war with the next town of Popperinge, and then beyond that via a route into France to the town of Hazebrouck. In the opposite direction, you could go across to Menin, beyond that to Courtrai, up towards Roulers and across to Brussels. So it was quite a connected point. In terms of tourism before the Great War, this was quite a quiet part of Belgium. In the medieval period, Ypres, of course, had been the centre of the European cloth trade, but by those, what we'd call in the Edwardian period, by that period, this was a place very much in decline in some ways, in terms of its key industry was gone. It relied heavily on agriculture, and the visitors that did come here came on the advice of the Baedeker's Guide, which referred to the city of Ypres before the Great War as a medieval gem of Europe. So it did get some British visitors in that respect, close enough to some of the ports like Ostend and Zeebrugge, where there were direct routes across to Britain. All of this made Ypres quite an accessible place, and that would be reflected in the routes to this area during the war as well. In 1914, it was Ypres and not Ypres as it is today, although this was a Flemish area of West Flanders, and Flemish Dutch was the local language. Belgium as a nation before the Great War was dominated by the Wallonians, by the French speakers, so all of these places had French names. And one of the reasons we know them by those French names is that British map data prepared by the War Office before the war was based on local map data which used these names. So rather than it being the true Flemish name for the city of Ypres, although Ypres itself has had something like 30-odd names, I think, over the centuries, Ypres was on our maps in 1914, and Ypres became the place that the British Army headed to in those early battles of the war. And in 1914, of course, what brought the British Army to Flanders, to the ground around the city of Ypres, was the German race to the sea, when having failed to reach Paris in the Schlieffen Plan and end the war with a lightning strike against the French, the German armies moved north to try and get to the Channel ports and outflank the French, most importantly, but also the men of the British Expeditionary Force, who moved up here into Flanders in the low ridges around the city of Ypres in October of 1914 and fought their first battle here, with the First Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914. Now, at that period of the war, it was a coalition war, coalition force that was fighting the battles around Ypres. It wasn't just the British. The Belgians, of course, were close by, fighting along the Yser, but a large amount of French troops, French colonial troops, French territorial troops, all fought here during that period. And the way into the battlefield was the use of railways. At that stage of the war, trains were extremely important in the movement of troops and equipment, and indeed they remained so for much of the rest of the war. And in 1914, with the front more fluid around the city of Ypres, trains could come from Hazebrouck in France, for example, bringing British troops or French reinforcements via Popperinge into Ypres railway station and the men detrained there and then marched to the front. So that became a vital link to the front line. When the front line was established around the city of Ypres during that winter of 1914-15, the British sector of the Western Front was to the south. So the village of St Eloi to the south of Ypres was where our line began at that point. Although we'd been fighting close to the city in 1914, in this period we'd moved a little bit further south, and then our line went across the border close to the town of Armentières, and then down towards the La Bassée Canal near villages like Givenchy. So that meant that the infrastructure put in here at that early stage of the war was French. The French were using the trains to bring troops in. The French were using the trains to bring supplies, equipment, ammunition in, and also evacuate their wounded. When the British extended their front slightly in 1915, and in the approach to the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915, this then became a British sector of the front. And following that second battle, where using poison gas for the first time, the Germans pushed very close to Ypres itself and took that so-called high ground that surrounded the city. And by high ground, we're talking about ridges that are only tens of metres above sea level. What it then meant for the city of Ypres itself is that it could be viewed from most of these German positions. So the idea of bringing a steam train at full pelt into the city of Ypres and unloading your men at the railway station was no longer really a prospect, because the Germans could see it, and if they could see it, they could shell it. And in that 1915 period in particular, Ypres started to get some very heavy bombardments from massive pieces of German artillery. There's an account of one officer who notices a shell, which is almost certainly a 420mm German shell, coming through the air like an express train, hitting the cloth hall, and a whole section of the cloth hall falling off as a consequence of this impact. So look at the railway station. You can imagine that battalions of men lined up here, having got off of a train, would be a perfect target for such artillery. So the railway at that point was no longer used, and thereafter troops instead detrained at Popperinge, and then eventually outside of Popperinge, and then marched up to the front along the roads, or if they were lucky, there might be some wheeled transport with lorries or old bill buses to bring them up to the forward area of the battlefield. So for 2 years, no trains ran into Ypres because of this problem with the Germans observing the city from the high ground, that long period of static trench warfare, and the old railway lines were torn up, the sleepers were used, the track was used, they used it to strengthen dugout roofs and things like this. And the section of the railway from near the railway station around the Lille Gate and up towards Hellfire Corner, you'll remember from the previous podcast about Hellfire Corner, was used as a trackway for infantry and artillery and supplies to get up to Hellfire Corner and close to the frontline positions. That changed with the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, and gradually during that battle we pushed the Germans back over these ridges until the front line was about 8.5-9 miles from the city of Ypres. And at that point the railway system was put back in place and trains ran in that period. So from the autumn of 1917 through to the early spring of 1918, when the Germans attacked during the Battle of the Lys, as we called it, and they broke through in the area around Passchendaele and along the Messines Ridge, and Ypres was almost outflanked at that point. So at that stage of the war, once again, it was just impossible to bring trains in. And when you look at trench maps of that period, you can see there is a very extensive railway network in and around Ypres, with sidings to the north near Bozinga, on parts of the old battlefield along the Pilchelm Ridge, where trains could take men right up onto a safe bit of ground where they could detrain there and move up towards the front line area around Passchendaele. All of that was captured. All of it was no longer in use because of the close proximity of German forces to the city, and trains were not restored again until the autumn of 1918, when with the Fourth Battle of Ypres in September and October of that year, the Germans were pushed back by British forces, American troops, Belgian forces to the north, and gradually their dominance of this ground diminished once more and trains could run again. Come the end of the war and those early months of 1919, when people began to return here, the military part of the railway was here. There was no regular timetable. This area was completely devastated after 4 years of war. It looked like some ancient ruin. You often see that phrase being used in post-war accounts of people coming back to Ypres. And if we'd have stood here outside the railway station then, would have seen a demolished railway station building, demolished by those 4 years of shell fire, would have seen all of the buildings around the station square completely flattened by the bombardments, and one of the few features recognisable would have been the beginnings of the ramparts over to our right, which we'll walk to shortly, and in the distance would have seen a bit of the tower of the Cloth Hall and a section of St Martin's Cathedral, the only tall buildings, or what was left of them, in the city of Ypres at that time. So this was utter devastation then, and as the rebuilding began, these buildings were demolished, rebuilt, the railway station was put back in place, and the train, from around about 1920, when we start to look at the battlefield tours that were available for people to take at that time, became an important way in for people to visit these battlefields now as pilgrims. So it was no longer soldiers coming to the front, it was veterans returning and the families of those who'd fallen here coming to pay their respects to a loved one and see perhaps a grave somewhere on the battlefields. And there were trains from Ostend, where again the ferries could bring them across from Britain. They could get the boat train across to Calais and then over to Hazebrouck and change there for Popperinge and Ypres. So it became, again, this route in. That's the important facet of it. And today it's less used than it was because the line to France was closed in the 1960s and you can no longer go Popperinge and then across to Hazebrouck. You can still go to Popperinge, and it's a great little railway journey to do because you see quite a lot of the Great War landscape as you travel along that area. But to get to France now, you have to go back to Courtrai and then change there to go to Lille. So it's not as important a route into the battlefields as it once was. But going back to the 1920s and 30s for a minute, considering this was the route in for people, and this was a place in which thousands of battlefield pilgrims would have passed through during that period, it also became a sort of a memorial square here in front of the station. So there was the wreck of a Mark IV tank used in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 that was on display here, and there was some German artillery as well. And on the far side of the square, and walking from the railway station now across and onto Stationsstraat, we'll go towards some modern buildings just ahead of us on the left. It's a corner building. I think it might be a bank now and some apartments above it, but this was the location of the Continental Hotel. Now, this was an important hotel in that period in the 1920s and 30s because this was the first hotel that you saw as you got off a train and was one of the places where many, many thousands of pilgrims to the battlefields and veterans who returned stayed during that period. Now, jumping back to 1980s and 90s, when I first used to come to the battlefields, I stayed here a couple of times, and on one occasion in the 1990s, it was with Tony Spagnoli, who wrote quite a few books on the Great War, and we'd come here to attend the unveiling of a plaque in St George's Memorial Church, and we sat there, Tony Spagnoli, my old friend John Dray, John Laffin, the Australian military historian, he was there too, Ted Smith, who co-wrote some of the books with Tony Spagnoli, and we sat there and we spoke about how important this hotel had been and what sort of conversations must have taken place between the veterans who were here. And the inside of the hotel at that time had really not changed at all since that interwar period. Some of the old wooden features and some of the same mirrors and tables. And we sat there, and it was really quite something to sort of think about that and think about what it must have been like for veterans to come back who perhaps at home had no way of discussing, of verbalising their experience, but back here on the battlefields, visiting men who had shared that experience with them, maybe not even in the same unit, but certainly in the same sectors, they could suddenly talk about it. And it must have been quite an important part of their way of coming to terms with their experiences in places like this. Sadly, that hotel was demolished in the early 2000s, and this modern building is what replaced it. But it was such an important link, really, to that interwar period when so many thousands of British people, I think at one stage in that period, something like 250,000 English-speaking people were coming to Ypres each year. I mean, it's staggering numbers that in many respects we've forgotten. So with those pilgrims in mind, and bearing in mind we need to begin our walk now, we're going to walk across to our right. The road bends round the next block of buildings, and there is a footpath that takes you up onto the ramparts, and that will be our next stop. We've walked up onto the ramparts now, and these were the city walls, effectively, that once entirely surrounded the city of Ypres. These are military features designed by the military architect Vauban in the 17th century, and these star-shaped fortifications are very common across this part of Europe, and indeed the wider aspect of Europe as well. War and conflict had passed through this region on many occasions, and a city rich on taxation from the cloth trade in the medieval period had enough money to be able to afford these sort of fortifications to make their citizens safe. So the walls were built. But by the time of the First World War, this type of defence was really redundant, and most of the city walls, most of these ramparts had been dismantled around Ypres, particularly on the northern and western sides of the city. So this was the beginning of this section of the ramparts here, but once it had been part of a continuous wall. And the only section that survives in its entirety is what we're about to walk from where we are now near the station, around to the Lille Gate, and then continuing around to the Menin Gate, and then just beyond. The rest of it can be seen in the makeup and the layout of the city of Ypres, but the actual walls themselves are no longer there, and long gone by the time of the Great War. But within these ramparts are chambers and tunnels and casemates, all of which were used by the British Army. And on this particular section of the ramparts, they constructed 2 pillboxes in 1918. These were 2 Moyer pillboxes, which were not observation bunkers, they were machine gun bunkers, and they contained Vickers machine guns. And these particular ones were built by the 57th Field Company and the 208th Field Company of the Royal Engineers in August of 1918, with help from the 105th American Engineers as well. Probably one of the first occasions in which American engineers built structures like this on the battlefields of Flanders. We tend to forget the American involvement in this sector in that summer and early autumn of 1918, when American troops, principally from the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Divisions, fought in this sector of the battlefields attached to the British Army at this particular point. So these 2 bunkers were parts of the defences of Ypres at that time. The Vickers guns could be used almost like artillery to lay down a machine gun barrage. And when you think about how close the lines were to Ypres from where we're standing, Hellfire Corner is not even a mile away from here, for example, and the front line was there. To the south at Shrapnel Corner, the front lines are very close to that, just the other side of Zillebeek. So this was part of the sort of system of defences, really, that the British constructed during that period. And again, when you look at the trench maps, you can see just how complex this system of defences was in that period of the war. And this type of Moyer pillbox is quite rare, not just here at Ypres, but right across the British part of the Western Front. It was a late war design, which was, I think, prefabricated in the UK and brought over and then put in place. And it had the guns inside, and these are in quite good condition, and there's an information panel there now explaining a lot more about them. And Peter Oldham's book Armageddon's Walls is a really good guide to the types of pillboxes that were on different parts of the battlefields, and also a gazetteer showing where they are today. And I'll put a link to that on the Old Frontline website, oldfrontline.co.uk. So we'll continue along the ramparts now, away from the bunkers. And it's a very interesting part of the city of Ypres to walk, really, these ramparts. I think many people come to Ypres and they go to the Menin Gate, or perhaps walk down to the Lille Gate and go to the Ramparts Cemetery, but they don't walk the entire ramparts itself, and it really is worth doing. And it's also very pleasant. The Belgians have made this into a very nice part of the city, and of a summer's evening walking along here, it's a really great thing to do. And it gives you, I think, downtime from being out on the battlefields, and a moment where you can pause and reflect over what you've seen and what that's meant to you. And I think that's quite an important part when you visit the battlefields of the Great War. So we'll continue, and it gets to a bend a little bit further up, and over to our left there are modern buildings. I think there's some supermarkets and warehouses and things like that. But there's quite a squared off area of buildings which is part of the old police station, and that at the time of the Great War was the infantry barracks. Now there was a garrison in the city of Ypres, as there was probably almost in every Belgian town at that point. And the Belgian regiments from this part of Flanders eventually formed the bulk of the Belgian army that would defend the Ypres front to the north of here up towards the coast. But during the war, when the British Army took over Ypres and it became their frontline city, the barracks, which is a massive structure with really thick walls, became an important point in which men would be billeted in the city of Ypres. You remember from our previous podcast about Ypres, the city came alive at night. During the day, the men were either deep down in cellars beneath the buildings of the city or in huge constructions like this, which was safe to billet troops. And it became a dressing station as well. There were medical facilities here. Later on in the Third Battle of Ypres, there were gun sites. And there was a cemetery here as well that was closed and moved to another cemetery post-war. The ruins of it, which were quite impressive and appear on a lot of the postcards of that period, and I'll put a couple of these onto the podcast website, were just demolished after the war. The actual infantry barracks was not properly rebuilt. And what is now the police station may have been a smaller version of those barracks post-war, but it has no military connection today, and there's no trace of the huge structure that once stood here. But it was an important part of the British garrison within the city of Ypres, and a place that many thousands and thousands of troops that passed through here were billeted in, stayed overnight in, rested in, came back to the trenches from, or were evacuated to as wounded soldiers during those 4 years of the war. And then from there we'll stay on the rampart walls now, we'll follow them round, and we can begin to see the shape and design of the fortifications here. These sharp angles as the wall turns and moves around is all part of the construction, the military construction of these defences, to give the defender excellent fields of fire onto any attacker that tries to get near these walls. And we see quite an appreciation of that as we walk round this part of the ramparts. That brings us up onto another section, and just ahead of us where the trees are, we can see the white splash of stone and the cross of sacrifice of a military cemetery, and that's our next stop. The Ramparts Cemetery where we are now is, in my mind, one of the most picturesque British cemeteries in the whole of the battlefields. It sits here in this unique little spot on the walls, the ramparts of Ypres, overlooking the moats, where there are swans and ducks in the moat beneath it. The modern world moves around it, but it sits in this almost perfect isolation. And here you are in a place of quiet isolation, a place of reflection in many ways, where you can stand amongst the dead of the Great War and think about all that that means and all that these battlefields mean to us more than a century later. Ramparts Cemetery was originally, however, started by the French, so there were French burials here at one stage. Remember that the French had occupied this sector in and around the city of Ypres during that winter of 1914-15, following the First Battle of Ypres. So quite a lot of the cemeteries actually within the city itself were actually started by the French army, and this was one of them. Those French graves were moved post-war to the French National Cemetery at Portesa, repatriated back to France to be buried in their own family graves, or in some cases taken to the French National Cemetery at Notre-Dame de Lorette, where men from many French battlefields of the Great War were subsequently reburied. But the British graves here started in February 1915, from that period in which the British began to take over the area around the city from the poilus, from the French army. And it then became a burial place for frontline units just to the south or southeast of Ypres, so units that were close to Zillebeek or down at Saint-Loire, for example. When a soldier was killed there, they were brought back here for burial. This included quite a lot of officers in the early period, popular officers who were killed, sniped, or killed by shellfire or rifle grenades in the front line were then brought back here for burial rather than in a cemetery closer to the battlefield itself. For all sorts of reasons. It could be that the unit was relieved, came back to Ypres, brought their dead back with them and buried them here. But also I think there was a symbolic angle to it, because most of the graves face those battlefields. It's as if they've placed the warriors overlooking the site of their mighty deeds. And I'm sure that that was in the mind of many of those who instigated burials on this spot. It was a cemetery also used by the medical facilities that were close by. Near to the Little Gate there was another dressing station at various points during the war, and men who died of their wounds there were occasionally buried here on the ramparts in this cemetery. But within the casemates and the chambers underneath us in these ramparts were many support units that carried out their work within the area of the city of Ypres. These were infantry pioneer battalions, for example, later men from the Labour Corps, Royal Engineers, Army Service Corps, all of the infrastructure that maintained and operated on the battlefield. And some of those units buried their dead here because although these men were not necessarily in the front line, Ypres was shelled and they had casualties as a consequence of the work that they were doing here. And you see this most particularly with a row of graves of men from the Maori Pioneer Battalion of the New Zealand Division. The entire unit was made up of Maoris, and they'd served with them at Gallipoli in 1915 and then on the Western Front from 1916 until the end of the war. So highly regarded were these Maoris that in the latter stage of the war you see Maoris being commissioned as officers within the Maori Pioneer Battalion, something that was much, much rarer, for example, in the comparative units within the British Army at that time. So these Maori Pioneers are some of the most visible part of the support unit troops that are buried in here, but you will see the badges of men from the Royal Engineers, for example, and some of the other infantry pioneer battalions amongst the graves that are in this cemetery. So it reflects that nature of this part of the city of Ypres, and reflects the way perhaps with those early casualties of men killed on the battlefield, buried overlooking where their deaths took place at Saint-Loire or beyond. It perhaps gives us an insight into how they saw the meaning of sacrifice. And there is one of the most poignant post-war images taken in this cemetery of two old comrades coming back here to visit a grave, and they're standing there, one of them kneeling down in front of that grave, and it became a picture postcard of the period, which you see quite frequently. So it must have really sort of plucked at the heartstrings of many a visitor in that interwar period. And I'll put an example of that image on the website so you can see what I'm talking about. It's just a small cemetery. There's 153 British burials here, 14 New Zealanders, 11 Australians, 10 Canadians, and 5 whose unit could not be ascertained. The unknown graves amongst them are pretty scarce because for the majority of burials here, these were men buried by those who served with them, those who knew who they were. Now, it's not just me that likes this cemetery, if like is the right word, but I think most of you listening to this will know what I mean. Many of you, no doubt, have been here if you've stayed in the city of Ypres. Many people come here of an evening after the last post ceremony at the Menin Gate, for example. But there was one person in particular who this was her favourite spot on the Western Front, and that was the author and historian Rose Coombs. Rose was a part of that group of people which included Lynn MacDonald, Martin Middlebrook, John Giles, John Terraine, who helped rekindle an interest in the Great War by writing really truly seminal books on the subject from lots of different angles. Lynn MacDonald with her veterans, Martin Middlebrook with his veteran interviews, but his incredible insight into the first day of the Somme and the Kaiser's battle. John Terraine challenging many of the myths that existed at the time of the 50th anniversary of the Great War, indeed beyond that. And Rose with her battlefield guidebook, because today with the internet and apps and hundreds of books about the battlefields of the Great War, it's very easy to pick on almost anything and find a guidebook covering that. But in those early days, Rose's book was really the only example of a single volume guidebook that took you across the battlefield, and many referred to it as the Bible to the Western Front. And this book was before Endeavour's Fade, the initials of which are BEF. So that's a bit of a nod, absolutely certainly, to the British Expeditionary Force, which was Rose Coombs' key interest in the Great War. And that book, published by After the Battle in many editions, and then posthumously turned into a new edition with colour photographs by the After the Battle team, still remains the key single-volume guidebook to the battlefields of the Great War. If you've never been across, or you've been across a few times, and you want to get an insight into the wider picture of the battlefields of the Great War, Before Endeavour's Fade should always be your starting point, in a book that really almost every Great War battlefield enthusiast should have on their shelves. And again, I'll put a link to that on the podcast website. Now, I had the pleasure of knowing Rose Coombs. She was a very formidable person, but a very kind person, incredible knowledge of the Great War, which she did not hesitate in sharing with those around her. I think it's one of those lessons that I learned in the early years of visiting the battlefields and studying the Great War. There were so many generous people who would share knowledge and contacts and information, and that's something I really believe in very, very strongly. And through the medium of things like Twitter, it's very easy to do that now, and so many other people do likewise, and it's always good to see that. And I'll give you an example. I met Rose. She worked at the Imperial War Museum. She was their special collections officer, and I'm sure that's a job title that she made up herself. It gave her sort of carte blanche to do what she wanted, really. But she was an incredible ambassador for the War Museum at that time. And I met her there one time, and I was going over to the battlefields in a few weeks' time, and she said, "Where are you going?" And I told her, she said, "Have you got any trench maps of that area?" And I didn't. So she said, "I'll leave it with me." And then about a week later, this big tube arrived, and inside was a 1-to-1 scale photographic copy of a trench map of this area of the battlefields around Passchendaele, which was absolutely invaluable for visiting that bit of ground on my next visit. But that's typical of her, and in typical of many of the people of that generation of Great War authors and enthusiasts who would share their knowledge and information with you like that. I went to Rose's funeral, and there was a huge number of people there, people who were inspired by her work. She was very heavily involved in the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association, and I think there was something like about 10 Victoria Cross recipients at the funeral. It's the one and only occasion in which I've seen a surviving VC recipient of the Royal Navy wearing the blue ribbon of the cross rather than the crimson ribbon of the Victoria Cross above his medal. And a little group of us went to the pub afterwards to reflect on Rose's contributions and how that might continue down the generations ahead. And here we are, that was nearly 30 years ago now, and her book, like I say, still stands as this incredible and influential volume for anybody that wants to go across to the battlefields of the Great War. And while Rose's name is perhaps not as well known as it should be, she'll always stand as that important pioneer in influencing our understanding and our commemoration, visiting of the Great War battlefields. And to add a bit of dimension to talking about her here on this podcast, I'm sure Rose must have done some television in her time, but there are no surviving clips of it on YouTube or indeed elsewhere. But what I do have is, to my knowledge, the only audio clip of Rose from a BBC radio documentary that I recorded off of the radio with an old-style tape recorder in the 1980s. And this little clip is her standing in Ypres communal cemetery talking about that particular part of the Great War battlefields.
This was almost the last action before the final advance up to Mons on the 4th of November 1918. It was the Battle of the Sambre, which is a battle honour, and here at Ypres there are two cemeteries. This is the communal cemetery extension, where there are about 50 graves, amongst which there is probably the most famous poet of the First World War, Wilfred Owen, 4 or more MMs, but there are 4 MMs in the same row as Wilfred, an MC and bar, and a VC, and just beyond Lieutenant Kirk VC, the Manchesters, there is Lieutenant Colonel Marshall of the Guards, also a VC. Both Kirk and Marshall won their VCs on the 4th of November, and both were posthumous.
It's rather sad, isn't it, that news of Wilfred Owen's death didn't come
through, yes, it was very sad, because I think they were, the family had thought they were safe.
Rose Coombs had requested in her will that her ashes be scattered here at Ramparts Cemetery. So this is her corner of a foreign field that will really be forever connected to her. And the city of Ypres installed a Rose Coombs walk here in her memory. And just as this cemetery had impressed Rose Coombs, just as this cemetery has impressed me on so many visits, and possibly so many of you, I'm sure that it will continue to impress future generations who travel to these battlefields and wish to connect to the Great War at places like this. So from here we'll leave the cemetery, we'll exit via the gate, and we'll turn right. That'll take us on the bridge, up over the Lille Gate, and onto the next section of the ramparts. As we come over the bridge at the Lille Gates and onto this next section of the ramparts, we're coming round to the eastern side of the city of Ypres. Over to our right, for example, would be Hellfire Corner, the Menin Road, beyond that Hoog, and then ahead of us to our right, in the far distance, would be the Frasenberg Ridge and the Pilkholm Ridge, and then beyond that, of course, Passchendaele. In the early period of the occupation of the city of Ypres, British troops actually bivouacked. They camped on top of this part of the ramparts. There's quite a few memoirs from that period of the war. H.S. Clapham's Mud and Khaki, for example. He was a soldier in the Honourable Artillery Company. He describes being billeted up here on this section of the ramparts in his memoirs, as do a few others. But of course, once the Germans took that high ground beyond the Hellfire Corner at the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, they had direct line of sight onto this section of the rampart, so to be up here, to be billeted on here, to move about here in the daylight hours was just impossible. So this top section of the ramparts wasn't as extensively used at that period. But there was a cemetery up here, another Ramparts Cemetery. That cemetery was closed post-war and then moved to another one. And there are a couple of photographs of the graves that were here. They appear to be from the 1914, 1915 period, so from in the earlier period of the British Army's role in the fighting here in Flanders. In recent years, the city of Ypres has renovated this part of the ramparts, and there's quite a few structures on it and sections of it that you can now go down into and visit, and that all enhances our understanding of what this was. And these are all positions that would have been used by the British Army at some point. And about halfway up, there's a nice modern bridge that goes across the moat here. So there's a tunnel underneath the ramparts which you can walk through and then walk up over the moats and join up with the battlefields beyond. It's quite an interesting route to walk from the centre of Ypres over that bridge and up towards the battlefield area. And it actually replaces one of several bridges that existed across the section of the moat here during the war itself. When you look at wartime images, there are photographs that show quite a number of these bridges across, coming from what are called sally ports. So these are positions on the ramparts, on the walls, where there's a little door where, when this was a defensive position, you could use these sally ports to go out and attack people who were trying to besiege the walls with ladders or siege equipment. So the British Army opened these up and they constructed bridges from those points across. So that meant that men could go from the safety of Ypres from behind the walls, through the chambers and tunnels in the ramparts, out via the sally port and over an improvised bridge built by the Royal Engineers to take them across the moat and into the network of trenches that existed beyond. So this was all part of the infrastructure on this part of the battlefields. And a little bit further up to our left is part of the casemates in this area known as the Kasematten. There's a brewery in here now which does a very, very nice beer, in fact several different types of beer. And it's also an area where the Ypres Times, that trench newspaper, that comical trench newspaper, was printed in 1915 and 1916 when an old printing press was found in one of the buildings near here, and it was used to print this trench magazine that was distributed to men from the various units within that division, 24th Division in this particular case. Now those were reprinted after the war and they became quite well known. And eventually the story of the Ypres Times was turned into a bit of television drama and also a stage play, which has been performed in one of the buildings close to the ramparts on a number of occasions over the last few years. And I've been lucky to see that here twice myself. And when it comes back after all of this, as I'm sure it will, it is really well worth going to see. And I would thoroughly recommend it. But as we move further along here, we come up to an area just before the Menin Gate, the end of our walk, where we come across some new memorials connected to the Great War, one of which commemorates Indian troops, and more modern memorials to Indian soldiers who served here on the Western Front have been placed at various locations to enhance our understanding and appreciation of the role of Indian troops in some of the key battles of the Great War, something we covered in an earlier podcast looking at the Indian Corps in the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, for example. But as we walk away from those and we come up to a bronze model of the Menin Gate, which was specially built for blind visitors to Ypres, so they could reach out and touch and feel the shape of the memorial ahead of them, we're coming to the end of our walk. We're coming to our goal, our visit to the Menin Gate Memorial. The vast archway of the Menin Gate Memorial ahead of us, it's an iconic monument to the Great War, and one of those that, for many people, this is where they take some of their first steps on the old front line. But what is the Menin Gate, and how did this memorial end up being here? With a city surrounded by ramparts, you had to be able to get in and out of it, and there were various gates at different points around the city where there were main roads going to the nearest town. So there was a Dixmude gate that took you to Dixmude, the Lille gate that we'd been to earlier took you to Lille, and the Menin Gate that took you out along the road to Menin. They were not physical gates, so they were not a swinging gate or some sort of barrier. There were gaps in the ramparts, and probably at some point there'd been toll booths there to collect a payment for those who were not citizens of Ypres coming in or possibly leaving, or it was part of the taxation system. All of that had been abandoned by the time of the First World War, and the key feature of the Menin Gate at that point were the two lions, symbols of Flanders, that stood on plinths before the gate itself, and a pub that was built into one part of the ramparts here that appears to have been quite a favourite with the locals in the years before 1914. When Ypres became a military city, this was an obvious route out onto the area where the fighting took place, and in that early period of the war, men who detrained from the railway station where we were earlier would come up through the city and exit out through the Menin Gate, go along the Menin Road and up to where the front line positions were, whether they were French or British or Commonwealth, later Commonwealth soldiers. But again, by that end of that second Battle of Ypres in May of 1915, it wasn't possible to use the Menin Gate because it was in direct observation. It was used at night, but it wasn't as frequently used as the Lille Gate, for example. So it was a less visited, less used exit and entrance into Ypres as it became later on, because by 1917, with the third Battle of Ypres, as the Germans were gradually pushed back again, this became a spot that was reused. So the Menin Gate, particularly during that third Battle of Ypres, with a huge number of men from Britain and the far corners of the empire, this would have been to them an iconic location connected to their service at Ypres at that time, where they would go to and from the battlefields. And it was said, there was a saying during the war, with the last man through, please shut the Menin Gate. So, like I say, it wasn't a physical gate, but that was a bit of an army joke. The ramparts were the biggest and strongest constructions within the city of Ypres, and their thick walls survived the German bombardments. But when you look at images of the Menin Gate, and again I'll put some on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, when you look at those images, you can see that the Menin Gate has taken a bit of a pounding because of its important strategic location in getting men up towards the battlefield area and as part of that supply route at different points during the war. The lions are damaged, the ramparts are damaged, the moat bridge is damaged and rebuilt and repaired many times. You can even see isolated graves. And the pub that I mentioned took a direct hit in 1915. And when this site was eventually cleared for the pre-construction period of the monument, the remains of the pub was found, but in it, the remains of Belgian citizens, civilians who died in Ypres before the city had been evacuated at the time of the Second Battle of Ypres. But as that immediate post-war period moved into the 1920s, the Imperial War Graves Commission, who were charged with the commemoration of the dead of the Great War, were beginning to look at the idea of building memorials to the missing, that vast legion of soldiers who had disappeared on battlefields like those at Ypres and who had no known grave, how to commemorate them. In previous wars they'd never been commemorated, but as the missing, soldiers who'd never returned, whose fate in many respects was often unknown, it seemed unfair somehow for those men to be not commemorated when permanent cemeteries were planned for those whose remains, whose bodies had been found. So the memorials to the missing were planned and built, and the main one here at Ypres would be constructed somewhere within the city. And Reginald Blomfield, who was the chief architect tasked with building this memorial began to look around the city for suitable sites. He didn't come straight to the Menin Gate. It was an obvious choice because of its symbolism during the war. He looked at other locations. But to build a monument big enough to commemorate tens of thousands of soldiers, in the end, this was the only choice. And work began in the 1920s, leading to the unveiling of the Menin Gate here on the 24th of July 1927. Originally, the memorial commemorated 55,000 British and Empire soldiers, as they were then, who had no known grave. By the time it was built, hundreds of men named on the monument had actually been found in the post-war clearances. So today, according to the latest figures on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, it commemorates 54,596 British and Commonwealth servicemen. Of these, the majority are British, over 40,000 are from Britain, nearly 7,000 are Canadians, over 6,000 are Australians, there are 564 South Africans, 421 Indians and 6 West Indians. Now there are some nations not present on there, the New Zealanders for example, they're commemorated on their own battle memorials at the different sites where the New Zealand Division fought, but it is a representative monument. And it doesn't commemorate all of them, as many people think. They think that all of the missing from Ypres are commemorated here. It covers a period from October 1914, from the fighting in the First Battle of Ypres, through to a date, the 16th of August 1917, when the British Army crossed the Steenbeck River during the Third Battle of Ypres. This was a dividing line between this monument and the continuation of the commemoration of the missing at the Tyne Cot Memorial in Tyne Cot Cemetery, a subject that we covered in a previous podcast. The reason for the division between these two monuments was largely space, that even the size and scope of this monument, it just wasn't big enough to commemorate all of the missing in Flanders. So 2 monuments in the end had to be built, the Menin Gate and Tyne Cot. But this is the one that people really think of when they think of the missing of Flanders. And at the unveiling ceremony in July 1927, when thousands of people came from Britain nearly 10 years after the end of the war with missing soldiers, there was always that hope that they might somehow turn up, they might come back, they may have lost their memories, be in hospital somewhere in Germany. But no, a decade after the war, the families assembled here for the unveiling of this monument had to accept that their loved one was never coming home, that the name that they would see on this monument was for them their degree of closure, acceptance, that he was never coming home. And Lord Plumer, who had commanded the British forces in the battlefields around Ypres for a sizable chunk of the war, was the man who was here to prevail over the unveiling of this memorial in 1927. And he said, "He is not missing, he is here." And this was a nod to the true purpose of these memorials, to bring alive, to record, to remember, to mark forevermore those who, by the fortunes of war, have been denied a proper burial place, as the memorial describes. And for Flanders, this was about half of those who died, of the 250,000 British and Commonwealth dead who died in defence of Ypres during the Great War. About half of them have no known grave. So it symbolises so much. When we stand here and we look at these long lists of names, it's hard to take in the thousands and thousands of lives that this represents. So let's have a couple of stories about the men who were on here to bring those names alive. The death of brothers in the Great War, it's something that is always tragic, and on this memorial there are many pairs of brothers, some killed at different points in the war, some who died on the same day. But perhaps one of the most tragic of all is the story of Arthur, Frank and Fred Rachel, 3 lads from East Ham, close to where my father's family comes from. In fact, they lived only a few roads away from where my grandmother lived. They were all regular soldiers who had joined the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, before the Great War, and had come back to Britain, formed up with their unit and gone across to Flanders in early 1915 and had been killed, all 3 of them, on the same day, on the 24th of May 1915, at the tail end of the Second Battle of Ypres. Their battalion had suffered terrible casualties, hundreds of men killed the same day in that action, and very few of them have a known grave. It could be that these men were once buried on the battlefields, but there was another 3 years of war ahead, and battle after battle often destroyed these early burial grounds. For the Rachel's parents, John and Annie Rachel, who lived in their home in Holme Road in East Ham, John Rachel, a workhouse foreman, and the brothers, 3 of 7 children, this was a devastating loss, undoubtedly made worse by the fact that not one of them had a known grave. How did families cope with that? It's hard for us to imagine, I think. The Rachels were all private soldiers, but this memorial commemorates every rank from private to brigadier general. There's one brigadier general on here, the most senior officer, most senior soldier on the gate. The former GOC Menin Road, General Officer Commanding Menin Road. And this was Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, VC, an officer of the Irish Guards who'd been awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery in the Boer War and commanded a brigade in the First Battle of Ypres, but with the loss of senior officers he took over a whole section of the battlefield until he was killed near Polygon Wood, possibly leading some men from his old regiment, the Irish Guards, into action there on the 11th of November 1914. His grave was not found after the war, and his name was added to the Menin Gate, like I say, the most senior soldier on here, and dispels that idea that every senior officer was somehow sort of some chateau general miles from the front. And here's one who's on a memorial to the missing, and it's all part of our understanding of the Great War. On the opposite side to the gate from Fitzclarence are some of the Canadian names, and men from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, a regiment formed in honour of the daughter of the Governor-General of Canada, who was himself a grandson of Queen Victoria, so Princess Patricia was a member of the British royal family. Amongst the names, when you look up the lists to where the officers are at the top, is Major Talbot Papineau, MC. Papineau has always interested me. I've talked about him previously in the podcast when we spoke about the Battle of Passchendaele, where he was killed in 1917. He joined up at the very beginning from a privileged background in Canada, came across, and the war opened his eyes to so many things. He wrote an incredible series of letters home to his mother, and he became a staff officer after being awarded the Military Cross for bravery on the battlefields near Ypres in 1915, and he accompanied the Canadian official photographers around the battlefield at Courcelette and Vimy Ridge, and he appears on quite a few of the photographs of that period. But he hated staff work. He wanted to be back with his old regiment and put in for a transfer, arrived just in time for the attack on Passchendaele, and was killed leading his men into action, again his body lost and never recovered. Papineau was a protégé of the then Canadian Prime Minister, and if he'd have survived the war, it's likely that he too would have gone on to become Prime Minister of Canada himself. And as a man from that privileged background, changed by the war, changed by his belief in how men were and what made them tick, how would that have changed his view of life, of politics, and the way he governed that nation post-war? We can only but speculate, because his promise of greatness was cut short here on the battlefields of Ypres in 1917. Just round the corner from Papineau, as you go up the steps to the upper levels, where the continuation of the Canadian names in that area carry on, just on the right is the beginning of the Royal Sussex Regiment panels. I was born in Sussex and I grew up there. It's a place that will forever be special to me in the history of this regiment and the veterans of that regiment that I interviewed in the 80s. And there are so many personal connections that we have to memorials like this. And on this panel here is Lance Corporal Harry West, MM. I am privileged to have his military medal and his other medals and those of his brother who was killed in my collection. He was a stretcher bearer. He was a man who went out and picked up the wounded, and he was awarded his military medal for bravery at the Boar's Head on the 30th of June 1916 at Richebourg in northern France, which again we've covered in a previous podcast. He went right through the battles on the Somme and was killed on the first day of the Battle of Passchendaele when they took over a German bunker near St. Julian as an aid post, and a shell came straight through the back door and killed everybody inside, the patients, the stretcher bearers, and all the medical personnel attending to the wounded. And that's probably how his name is added to this memorial. So many names, so many stories. We could spend hours and hours on this podcast talking about them all. And it of course prompts us to think what a memorial like this represents, what it symbolises. Is it men just blown to pieces? In some cases, like Harry West, yes, almost certainly. For others, they disappeared in the muds. The terrible stories of that Battle of Passchendaele in 1917 and the whole area around Ypres as this vast quagmire Guns and tanks and horses and mules all disappeared in the mud, and along with them the bodies of the fallen. In some cases men once were buried, but their graves lost, or the crosses or the markers that indicated their graves were lost, and in the post-war period when their bodies were found they could not be identified. When you wander the cemeteries around Ypres, you see thousands and thousands of unidentified soldiers, and whoever they were, they're either commemorated here on the Menin Gate or at Tyne Cot. So many ways a man could go missing, so many ways a man could disappear. A cruel hand of the war, a missing soldier, because it gave hope against the impossibility of a soldier somehow surviving, hope that he might come back. And some families, despite the construction of these memorials, despite the naming of their names on these panels, never really truly accepted it. Lynn MacDonald, who passed away last week, wrote about Ernie Gaze of the Army Cyclist Corps, who was killed on Hill 60. Buried on the battlefield, his grave was later lost, and Ernie's poor mother never, ever accepted that he wasn't coming back. There was always hope that he'd return, and even late in her life she would tap young men on the shoulder in a local market that resembled Ernie, hoping they'd turn round and it was him. But like so many men, their journey's end was here in Flanders, and they were never coming home. But the story of these missing soldiers is not one that has closed, not one that has ended. With the increase in archaeology in the last 2.5 decades around Ypres, the remains of more and more soldiers are found each year as projects to clear the battlefields ahead of development uncover the remains of soldiers from the First World War. Men once named here have been brought in from the cold and now lie in marked graves. Digitally, their names have been removed from the Menin Gate's database. Eventually, their names will be removed from the panels, as and when work allows. It's a never-ending story. We often say how the last page of the Great War will perhaps never be turned. In the year following the construction of this memorial, old soldiers in Ypres came down and played the last post on particular anniversaries. The anniversary of the First Battle of Ypres, of Messines, of Passchendaele. And then a year later, the local people of Ypres, the local fire brigade, played the last post every evening, then at dusk and later at a specific time as it is today, to remember the sacrifice of that 250,000 men from Britain and the Empire who fell here during the Great War. This ceremony, this simple but moving ceremony, marks each night not a British attempt at commemorating the dead, but the generous spirit that remembers the fallen from a Belgian perspective. Each night the gate resonates to the sound of those bugles, and it echoes somehow along the Menin Road and past Hellfire Corner. It doesn't just lament the dead, it somehow calls to them. The Menin Gate acts like a beacon, because out there are countless questions yet to be answered. There's still so much for us to find along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.